it's fair to say that the 22nd Prelude and Fugue in B-flat minor can be considered the apotheosis of Book 2. The magnificence and the majesty of the forms involved, and at the same time the intrinsic relation of the elements, the simplest molecular elements of the subject and counter-subject, not only of the fugue, but of the prelude. The prelude is as tightly constructed in its quadlibet style of shifting counterpoint and different subjects between voices, is a symphonia, but has that sense of emulating an instrumental trio. That brings up ideas of expressivity not available in the time on the harpsichord in terms of dynamic feeling. But we work very hard with this prelude to deal with the various contours, conflicting and otherwise, between voices, so that we're not looking at things vertically, we're looking at very much a continuum. We begin with 4 quavers falling from the third. The downbeats are never solid. They're like sand castles. We get them and then we're going with there are all these interruptions. The falling figure of the first element in all of its figurations, the scale passages and also the cantus, the end of that particular element in crotchets. And the second element, there's every reason to suspect B-flat minor was a leave-taking, a stock-taking. There's something to be said, particularly for the B minor in Book 2, of being serendipitous, fantastical. After all of this complexity, like the quadlibet at the end of the Goldberg Variations, we're doing this very, very lightheartedly, dealing with very thorny subjects, but in the end, it's to bring joy. Why we bring it to life the best way we can. The contour of the falling figure and the contour of then the rising figure has to be very graded. Every passage, every interval, a falling second needs to be falling in volume. A rising second might want to be rising in volume, but if it's the end of a 2-note slur, it's the weak link, so we should always think about making that impetus, the downbeat and the release, the relief. All this can be intertwining. We tend to see these pieces as rather vertical organizations of harmonic events. They really have to be voices, and the more we make a contrast articulatively between the elements and point out when we are dealing with a microcosm of the element involved, as we do, that we have that feeling of having a characteristic for each of those articulations. This has the feel of wanting to be a binary prelude, but like the andante that begins the B minor in Book 1, a stately movement. We can imagine pizzicato bass notes. Also looking back to that kind of construction, that was a binary structure. This one, because of its harmonic framework and because of the ways in which the episodes intersect and interlock and create new vistas of invention and variation, there is that tightness of organization and comprehension, a massive structure based on the simplest of elements, the toggle between a minor second and a major second, the confluence and the inversions of those make up the rhetoric of not only the prelude but the fugue. This is the most expressive of all the preludes, I think it's fair to say. I know that Bach himself had a particular resonance. We associate him with B minor, but here we have the B-flat minor prelude, the second subject that we will be utilizing throughout in juxtapositions with the first element and other inventive material, something that we would recognize. Comes from the B-flat minor prelude of Book 1. It's the only invocation, so direct, in the same key, and looking back now from at least a 20 years distance from Book 1, leads us to feel that there is not a leave-taking, but a certain nostalgia. There are intimations of mortality in this prelude. When I mentioned that this was the most expressive prelude, we understand, we feel the pathos of this movement. Expressivity has to do with actual relationships and shadows of figures. Falling figures should fall dynamically as well as intervallically. Likewise, rising figures should rise. In that way, it's not enough to make things clear. And this is a prelude that comes from, ideally, an instrumental trio. Continual bass. Invoking an instrumental trio is trying to create more expressive than the keyboard at the time, certainly. Clavichord had that pliable ability, but the piano really has more than we ever give it credit for. We have to stop looking at these things vertically and look at them instead as independent voices. There'll be a lot of very microcosmic, microdynamic. One note to another will be a real shape, and the more we exaggerate that shape in contradistinction to another voice which may have another goal, maybe coming away from a goal and going away, and we are going to a goal dynamically in the space of a quarter note. And the more that we juxtapose those dynamic arcs, the more exaggerated we can make them, because in juxtaposition, the edges are taken a little off. I know I've sometimes made long statuesque notes of fugue subjects very long at the beginning, only to make them, for reasons of transparency, a fair amount shorter. We recognize the tune, we see that it's a slightly sparer, slightly more detached texture, but that is in the service of a higher transparency, more fluency and lyricism in the upper voices. We make these changes, we want to address each voice on its own, but then don't be afraid to experiment with those kinds of juxtapositions of rather extreme dynamic arcs. For instance, we're not doing this note by note. I just don't see any point in it. First of all, it's a clumsy articulation. It's a clumsy way to do a melody. I mean, if you were singing this, we would be naturally falling. Perhaps not even volume, but a fall of tension from an inception to a decay, an impetus and a release. And so meanwhile, the falling step is an echo of this falling figure that is in essence the four quavers, which will be massively varied, juxtaposed, and utilized in development. It's not a good idea to just for the sake of making a long line, making a line of the whole subject. If we were singing it, there would be different syllables on these. You wouldn't see a slur over a vocal line. You would just understand that all of these elisions and connections and slight separations would be a matter of applying whatever consonants we were to the rhetoric. And now all this falling, falling, falling. There's a great temptation to, along the way of the piece, to make that more didactic, but we need to instill this habit of making precipitous and noticeable decline. Part of that strategy, and it will happen all of the times that we make a statement of this first element. This material is almost as tight as a fugal arrangement. It's only due to the fact that Bach relegates himself to one falling figure and one rising figure. The rhetoric of that dichotomy is what makes up the entire prelude, the juxtaposition, the transposition of voices of material, this B flat minor ultimate element. And so yes, the nice thing about being able to diminuendo at the end of these subjects, we can start from nothing, because we want to start from nothing, so we want to have the continuum. We don't want to have, we want to have slightly separated, and I'm looking at these crotchets as placeholders. I will decide as this will be a largely legato texture. I will seek to make these begin in a rather separate place. It's like the first time we hear it. Did we hear it? It's a good thing we're starting from nothing here, because we don't need to work on this subject first element material anymore. We don't need to bring it out. We understand it's this beautiful cascade, but it's doubled. And so if anything, the outer voices should be even softer. So we're really starting this second element literally from nothing, with no assistance from the outer voices. at the end of this. It's an inversion of the first element. And then another elaboration of it. And then this sounds to me, what does it sound like to you? It's not the first time we're going to hear the Dies Irae in this piece. It's another opportunity for us to have a moment of thought. Come away in this bass moment, and we can allow that to contribute to an upward pattern in the alto voice. We can still be singing when we arrive at this new iteration of the first element, now in the soprano voice. It's nice to be able to sing, but it's possible, and we don't have to work so hard at it if we come away with the bass. We're leaving the room, we're leaving the transparency, we're leaving the space for the diva to come out. No need to press, float up there. The entrance of the first element is a matter of importance, but and these scale patterns. It's not really doing anybody any favors, and it allows us a little bit more up and down so that the soprano voice can follow its own contour. So we can actually come up a little bit at the end there for clarity's sake. Because we're going to come away there. We've already come away with the left hand, so it's not a train wreck, it's not a dynamic catastrophe. We're coming away with two voices at different times. And as we come away, that leaves us the way in to finally have this second element, this second subject in the dominant and in the soprano voice. So that lends a certain fragility. We're still in this section in a very diaphanous and fragile texture, in fragile registers. Follow this down. We're going to do a little rise at the very end. It's going to be helped by the fact that the alto voice will retire a little bit. Transparent with that alto voice. We don't have to emerge dynamically so much. I've largely been doing this in a very fragile way, and we definitely want this to be a much more operatic and dramatic entrance of that elaboration of the initial subject. Coming away there. And then that's going to be the voice that we're going to follow. Nice way for us all to come away. This episode based on, we have the interpolation and exchange between voices of elements of the first element and the second. Based on absolute imitation of our figure from measure 7. Here's the first one. And now in the alto voice, in the bass again, and now in the soprano. All of these arrivals are elisions. Even our opening is not... It's not an arrival on the tonic, it is an ornament on the tonic, this falling figure from the minor third. All of our downbeats in this movement are elisions, no non-continuous cadence. We are always carried off on the wave of quavers. Here, even though we make this nice arrival, we can make the arrival and we can come up with the bass a little bit. Because we're distracted with the beauty of our bass line, we can do this with separation to distinguish the voices. In light of the fact that we have continuing quavers, when we have these moments of those inversions of this figure, which come from the second element, in order to distinguish the running quavers from those, I do a little... We're in a basically legato texture in the left hand. It's rather obscured how short I'm playing them. Always a little bit more resurgent for the tied notes. It makes it very easy. We're not competing with voices. Falling dynamically. Not continuous legato and crescendo and continuous sound, but rising, falling, falling. I'm doing even a little bit of separation between these quarters. This is my new favorite marking, this with that. We have a connection, but we have a tenuto sense of connection. So that there's a little bit of... We can do a little bit more connection here in this voice. This calls up the idea of looking like it could very easily be a binary movement. We don't have a repeat. As I say, we don't have any strong cadences. Into the bargain, David Ledbetter points out that we should think of this as a ternary structure. 3 sections. The first section end actually happens not until bar 41. We're getting a structural point here in that this is a rare bass subject entry. The next bass entry will be this one in the dominant of the subdominant. The next bass entry that we will experience is this one in F minor. And it's also interesting in that we have the first element begins on the minor third, the third degree of the tonic of B flat minor. This one in F minor. This entry of the first element in A flat major, related more succinctly as the dominant of the third degree of D flat major. We have this. This actually begins not on, if it were in A flat major in its original form, right? It's a different thing. It starts on the tonic instead of the third. There'll be other opportunities for us to examine the first element entering on different scale degrees is a structural point that we really need to make resonate in our own particular way. This starts out in the tonic. This bass iteration gets into this G-flat major flavor. It has a very hopeful sense about it, but I don't see still at this point that there's a great reason to accumulate the sound. I hope it doesn't feel like I'm saving it for something. Well, I actually am saving it for something, but I find that it's much easier to make these shapes if we have a very clear delineation about where things end and making sure that they end dynamically, if not in rubato fashion, but in dynamic direction and arc. Things begin and things finish. You have marked dots on these. We want this to be the only one that really resounds. These are just wind-ups. We want to just get the string moving. We don't want to make it didactic, leading into... thinking about planning this and then this, and everything before that has to be fit in underneath it. Not a continuation of the sound, but a continuation of the plan of the main notes of the sound. And so that way, if we play these a little bit shorter, we can pay a little bit more attention to making a slightly more legato texture out of this, since we're at a very wide scope. We're in no danger of distinguishing problems between the alto and the soprano voice. The main purpose of this passage is to distinguish between the alto and the bass, and we do that with articulation. And again, and that makes it easier for us to emerge here from a lower dynamic. That dovetailing, ending not until the second beat of this measure bass is already on the rise from nothing. It's fair to say that we are adding warmth to this passage. One of the ways I like to add warmth is to let these apparent tandem sixths be still a colloquy of voices. I do that in this passage by slightly bringing out the alto voice, not in deference to the soprano, but in defiance of the soprano. No, just it adds warmth. The lower notes add the overtones to the upper. It adds warmth. It's not a particularly important figure, but I still like being able to do this as a moment of fragility in that moment of our playing this in D flat major. Likewise, beginning on the third. So a true iteration of the first element. End with the right hand, begin with the left hand. But rather than bring one out to the exclusivity of the other, what I'm doing is one of my shift of focus routines, so that I'm making sure that we have a true juxtaposition of opposite articulative plans when possible. And when we want to keep within the singing lyric touch, then we decide to make different parts of these voices foreground and background. So here, now I take over with left hand. And now the right hand. hand softer, and now the left hand takes over, and now the right hand. And then it comes quicker and quicker, that juxtaposition. So it's not just a matter of getting louder, it's a matter of interchange of voices. Our interchange of focus becomes much quicker, and that in itself brings us to a very exciting close of this first section. There, but there should be a separation so that we can acknowledge what a great leap this is. If we just do it legato, yes, my hand can reach that far, but that doesn't say anything. The second section begins with an elision, starting on the tonic in A flat major with the immediate juxtaposition of the subject and second subject material between voices. I like to do a little bit of separation. More than that, really trying to make a big dynamic change. Not we want it to sound like a separate voice. And one of the ways that we can allow ourselves that kind of dynamic leeway is by doing what we say we will do. Coming away there. So there's a transparency. There's not a continuous barrage of sound. We are dealing with fluency and pliancy. Have two opposing, very closely voiced here. So you see I've marked a stress here on the downbeat. But what happens in the soprano voice? So we have to do a weak stress on the upper note because it's right? We don't want them doing the same things. It makes the dissonances that much more poignant because we're not approaching them as some kind of consequent assemblage of minor seconds. We are approaching them as voices that have different and absolutely integral functions, melodically, motivically. They just happen to form that dissonance. We have to really conspire to make these two voices quite separate. Slowly. Biggest crux, the biggest crisis is here already. I'm thinking that we're approaching this G flat major moment, and we can be not quite so sticklerish about it. We can let both voices sing, but the point is to keep that in reserve and not make it the default and end up painting yourself into a corner and not knowing how to make a differentiation. Make the plan a gradual plan over the course of this episode. That's truly a combination of the voices because this voice doesn't continue the first element, the soprano voice does. We can go ahead and in opposition to the way we're treating this one, we can actually, because it's both subject and the result of this suspension. Another subterfuge, another subversion of what could be a glorious arrival, a strong cadence. But again, it's held over the bar line. I've actually marked them really separate so that we can make a distinction between the bass legato and the upper voice in the context of a general legato. away and coming to. Compass, a wider scale and scope to these motives, added harmony to our counterpoint and our development. I want to make our focus, and now the right hand, right? Rather than right? Why not share the wealth? Shift the focus. I just think this is too explosive to ignore. At the same time, I find that we should really be back in our very contemplative sense of atonement in this section, in this very penitential moment. We will come to our second and final iteration of the Dies Irae. And rich point of harmonic interaction and interchange. It makes it less precipitous if we actually just do it with the left hand. The right hand is saying, what's your problem? We're back in our old favorite spot. The bass wants to go solo. The quickened harmonic changes, I'm feeling like this particular elision is a complete recapitulation. How do we characterize the opening of this reiteration, this recapitulation, with this clarion of what we've accomplished, where we've gone? We have this third section that will begin as a complete restatement of the opening motive, but also with some added changes. First thing that's going to make it possible for us to do this outburst is to follow. So it's not some subito piano here, but we are already moving down with soprano and rising with the bass. Rising and falling, rising up and falling down, as William T. Vollmann would say. This rising and falling idea is cornerstone of the expressivity of this movement, to really follow each contour, each line in its microdynamic iterations of rising or falling, making that a palpable textural part of this movement. Expressivity is not a matter of playing the melody louder or bringing out some weird thing that you decide is just so gorgeous. I think expressivity is the interaction of voices and the creation of the subsidiary and accompanying voices, all counter-subjects or subjects themselves, is a contributive factor to a total colloquy, in this case a four-voice colloquy. And so the differentiations that we need to do and the expressivity that we need to accomplish has to do with the juxtaposition of dynamic arcs and the acknowledgement of each voice's particular arc in every one of its moments and motions. I can even go further with this left hand. Accomplishing the diminuendo with the right hand and finish. I don't have to make a subito piano on the downbeat. I've already gotten us there. I've already cradled us into this downbeat. answer is in the tonic in B flat minor. This section is that we've actually gained a new voice, a new harmonic environment in which this tonic iteration is allowed to be more like its original self because we are diminuendoing. I just like the more activity in this A flat and in this episode that goes from E flat minor and eventually ends up in B flat minor. Because there's more active harmony, I like the idea of a little bit more active colloquy, a little bit less meditative. This one is not meditative, but stentorian and structural, fierce and climactic. But here we're ruminating on that outburst, bringing us back into this third section, a recapitulation on the subdominant. More active here, and then yes, we can be more ruminative and meditative when we finally have the answer in the tonic. We will then, by having saved that more ruminative aspect, we will have saved it for the actual reappearance, the answer in the tonic. Sections. That's what makes these elisions so compelling. It's not a frustration, a lack of a strong arrival. It is just the beautiful dovetailing, the end of one thing overlapping with the beginning of the other. Soft pedal this. The more we hear this subliminally, the more we can concentrate on the exterior voices and their development. We don't need to reiterate this. We can begin it from literally nothing and it will stay in our subconscious until we reach this little climax here. We can work towards that climax from a very long range. To think of it as one of the actual elements of this, because it will now become part of the development. This suspensions become much more quick. But yes, that falling half step is iconic in terms of the structure and in terms of the acknowledgement of our first element. When we get to this B flat minor, this is really a development of this interplay between those voices. And here again we want to say falling from there, rising, and so this is really it's not a downbeat, but it is stronger than that, and we fall from there, crescendo, fall there. Pick out the voices, we just have to make room for them. Very good plan. To make this one more, it's going to be one of our long pedal extensions, so we give it a nice whack. To shift the focus very slowly. Right in, left, right, left, right, left. What that does, it acknowledges the rising quality, the inexorable rising quality now of this motive, the irrepressible upward trajectory of this pattern. We've never had anything like this in the piece before. That is the figure that we're using for this episode. To is the first rising figure, most continuous rising figure we have, based on that figure. This figure in bar 7 is the basis for it. That's the first true iteration. All 8 notes of the measure are devoted to that figure. And when does it happen again? And it is developed in stretto. That brings us to this climax. So it's important to acknowledge, yes, the inexorable upward trajectory of this figure, inexorable all the way through this pedal, and to also understand that we should shift the focus a little bit so that it's not an inexorable crescendo, that we can break up the crescendo in constituent focuses, that I'm going back and forth between these voices in terms of what I'm implicitly trying to bring out. Right, left, right, bottom voice, top voice. You can really scream those last 2 notes because we haven't been beating it to death. Come out as much as you like. I like the fact that it's emerging from the pack rather than some straight trajectory. Leap of the major 7th. We have that a fair amount, and so I do a little bit of separation there. I decide to make this a connected moment. This one a separated moment. Bass has the final argument. That part of the element. In deference to this inexorable rising figure that is irrepressible in its enthusiasm and its hope, I decide, yes, this is the moment with these rising figures, then the Broadway-like reprise of the elements in inversion and verso, to make this moment the biggest of the piece. I sometimes get to the end of this prelude and said, how do I get here? I've all along been circumventing and subverting the feeling of a strong downbeat by making these elisions dynamic. And these elisions invariably have to do with the ending of a phrase really being truly the end softly, so that we can begin its dovetailed episode from nothing, not from a solid downbeat, but from a fluid downbeat. The idea of this as the falling motive as just an ornament, but yes, essentially structural to our invention, variation, and juxtaposition of elements. The falling idea. And then the rising. Constant juxtaposition has to be acknowledged dynamically on a constant, moment-to-moment basis, and then we have to acknowledge the accumulation of one set of values rather than another, more of the quaver figure than the scholarly, fugue-like statements of the subject, to the inexorable rising line that leads us to finally an apotheosis.